On a standard Tuesday afternoon in a high-security biotech facility in Lower Manhattan, the atmospheric sensors are calibrated to detect a deviation of less than 0.01%. Everything in that room is measured. The temperature of the reagents, the flow rate of the centrifuges, even the carbon dioxide exhaled by the researchers. It is a world where the unknown is simply a variable that hasn't been solved yet. On May 4th at 2:47 in the afternoon, the lead researcher in Lab 4, a man trained to trust only what can be weighed and replicated, stepped away from his station. The security footage shows him stop. He doesn't clutch his chest. He doesn't fall. He simply becomes a statue. For 3 minutes and 42 seconds, his heart ceased all mechanical function. In the medical report, it is listed as a sudden cardiac arrhythmia of unknown origin. But the man who returned from those 3 minutes didn't come back with a medical mystery. He came back with a set of observations that violate every law of thermodynamics he spent his life defending. He isn't here to talk about a miracle. He's here to report a system failure that hasn't reached the surface yet. I was looking for the light source. That was my first instinct. I'm standing in a space that shouldn't exist. And instead of wondering if I'm dead, I'm trying to calculate the refractive index of the air. It was bright. Not like a sun, more like the air itself had been electrified. I remember thinking that the lumens were off the charts, but my eyes weren't watering. My pupils weren't contracting. That was the first red flag. If the physics don't work, you're looking at a hallucination or a breakdown in the sensory hardware. And then I saw the device. It looked like a balance. You see them in old legal buildings or chemistry museums. 2 pans suspended from a central beam. But the scale was massive. I tried to find a point of reference, a wall or a floor, but the horizon just kept going. If I had to guess, the beam was the length of 4 city blocks. It was made of a material that looked like a high-density alloy, something between gold and polished bone. It was perfectly still. I stood there, 3.5 minutes of clinical death according to the hospital logs, and I wasn't praying. I was looking for the wires. I was looking for the projector. I told myself it was the dimethyltryptamine, the chemical the brain releases during trauma. I thought, okay, Denzel, this is just the hardware misfiring on its way out. It's a chemical spike. It'll pass. But the resolution was too high. You don't get this kind of detail in a dream. I could see the grain in the metal. I could hear the silence, and I know how that sounds. It wasn't just an absence of noise. It was a vacuum, a pressurized quiet that sat on my skin like lead. I looked at the pans of the balance. They were hovering, suspended by nothing I could identify. On one side, there was a weight. It looked like a cluster of shadows, shifting and dense. On the other side, there was something else, a flicker. I tried to walk toward it, and that's when the memory of the lab hit me. It didn't fade in. It slammed into my awareness like a physical impact. The environment Denzel is describing, a space of extreme sensory detail and a sense of realer-than-real reality, is a hallmark of near-death observations. But notice his reaction. He isn't looking for a divine figure. He's looking for the light source. He's looking for the wires. This is what we call the persistent professional lens. In a study published in the journal Resuscitation, researchers found that even under extreme physiological stress, the brain often defaults to its most ingrained training. A pilot looks for the instruments, a scientist for the variables. Denzel is trying to apply the scientific method to a situation that has already discarded the laws of physics. He isn't a believer yet. He's a skeptic with a front row seat to his own extinction. The lab was cold. That's what I remember most. We keep the filtration suite at 64 degrees to protect the protein chains. I was working on a sequence for a new antimicrobial coating. It's tedious work. You spend hours watching a digital readout, waiting for a curve to flatten. I had the pipette in my right hand. I remember the weight of the nitrile gloves, the way they make your skin sweat after 6 hours. I felt a pop. It wasn't painful, and it was just a mechanical failure, like a belt snapping in an engine. I felt the pressure in my neck drop to 0. I tried to reach for the emergency alert button on the edge of the bench, but my arm didn't belong to me anymore. The nerves weren't firing. I watched the pipette slide out of my fingers. It hit the floor and shattered. I remember being annoyed. That was a $400 piece of glassware. Then, the floor came up to meet me. But I didn't hit it. I was drifting. I was about 12 feet up, hovering near the ventilation ducts. I could see the top of the refrigeration units. They were covered in a thin layer of dust that the cleaning crew always misses. I made a mental note to tell them about it. Then I saw myself. I was sprawled out next to the centrifuge. My face was pressed against the linoleum. It looked wrong. The color was off. I've seen enough biological samples to know when the oxygen stops. I looked like a specimen. The door burst open. It was Sarah and Miller. I saw them start the protocol. Miller was on the phone. I could hear him yelling for the internal medical team, his voice bouncing off the sterile walls. Sarah started compressions. I wanted to tell her she was too high on the sternum. She was going to crack a rib. I remember shouting it. I was screaming at the top of my lungs, "Sarah, move your hands down 2 inches. You're losing the leverage." But she didn't hear me. She just kept pushing. I watched her sweat hit my lab coat. I wasn't scared. I was frustrated. I was watching a group of highly trained professionals fail at a basic mechanical task. I felt a strange distance, like I was reviewing a peer-monitored study from a glass booth. I was counting the beats. 1, 2, 3. She was going too fast. The blood wasn't having time to fill the chambers. "You're doing it wrong," I thought. "You're going to lose the sample." And then the room started to stretch. The walls of the lab pulled back. The white light of the fluorescent tubes started to bleed together, and the cold changed. It wasn't the air-conditioned chill of a lab anymore. It was something deeper. I pulled away, not because I wanted to. It was like a magnetic force had switched polarities. I was being hauled out of the room, through the ceiling, through the layers of concrete and steel of the Manhattan grid. I looked down one last time and saw the medical team charging the defibrillator. I saw the paddles hit my chest, I saw my body jump, and then I was back at the balance. What Denzel is describing is a phenomenon known as an out-of-body experience, or OBE, during a cardiac event. While skeptics often point to oxygen deprivation as a cause, the AWARE study, led by Dr. Sam Parnharnia at NYU Langone, examined patients who could accurately describe events that occurred in the room while they were clinically dead. Denzel's observation of the dust on top of the refrigeration units is a veridical detail. It's a specific, verifiable piece of information that he shouldn't have been able to see from his position on the floor. When we look at these accounts, we have to ask why the mind, in its final moments, would focus on something as mundane as a cleaning error. Unless, of course, the mind isn't just a byproduct of the brain. Unless the observer is still observing, even when the heart is still. I'm back in front of the device. The balance. I'm trying to keep my breathing steady even though I realize I don't have a chest to move. The shadows on the left pan are getting heavier. They aren't just shapes. They're movements. I could see scenes flickering inside the dark mass. I saw a man in an office 3 zip codes away. He was signing a document. I knew, without being told, that the signature was a lie. It was a transfer of funds that didn't belong to him. I saw a woman in a high-rise looking at her reflection and feeling a surge of something so sharp it felt like acid. Not hate, but a kind of pride that was so thick it was choking her. It wasn't a judgment. It was a measurement. I saw the city. My city. But it didn't look like the New York I know. It looked like a biological map. I could see the streets, the subways, the buildings, but they were pulsing. The whole thing was one giant organism, and I could see the necrosis. There were these black spots. Small at first, a lie told in a boardroom, a hand reaching into a pocket that wasn't theirs, a child being ignored in a basement. Every time one of these things happened, a tiny black flag would sprout on the map. I looked at the map of the whole country, spread out behind the balance. It was covered in them. Thousands of these dark markers. They were clustered in the cities, but they were spreading into the rural lines too. It looked like a systemic infection. I reached out my hand. I wanted to touch the map to see if I could wipe the spots away. I'm a scientist. My whole life has been about finding the cure, stopping the spread, fixing the anomaly. But as my hand got close, the air around the balance began to vibrate. It was a low frequency, something that rattled in my non-existent teeth. And then a voice came. It didn't come from a person. It came from the atmosphere. It was the sound of 1,000 glass slides shattering in perfect unison. "The equilibrium is shifting," it said. I froze. I've spent my life looking for answers in the numbers, in the results, in the peer-reviewed reality. But there was no experiment for this. Who's in charge of the calibration? I asked. I know, it's a ridiculous question, but it was all I had. I needed to know who was responsible for the machine. The silence that followed was heavier than the dark on the scale. I looked up past the beam of the balance into the electrified air, and that's when I saw the first flare of the fire. It wasn't here yet. It was downstream. In the future. A thermal anomaly that was so large it didn't just burn buildings. It burned the air itself. I looked at the date on the edge of the map. I couldn't read it like a calendar, but I felt it. It was close, the turn of June, the end of May. Is this the result? I whispered. Is this what the numbers lead to? The voice didn't answer. Instead, the balance tipped. The dark side hit the bottom with a sound that felt like a tectonic plate snapping, and the world around me began to dissolve into ash. I tried to catch the ash. That was my first reaction when the environment started to break down. I reached out, expecting the flakes to be warm, maybe carbon-based, the soot you'd find after a structural fire, but it wasn't hot. It was cold. It felt like dry ice hitting the skin, a sharp, biting sensation that sucked the heat right out of my hand. I looked at my palm. There was nothing there, no residue, no gray smear. I'm standing in the middle of a systemic collapse, and I'm trying to run a field test on the debris. I told myself, Denzel, your brain is just rendering a metaphors for death. This is a neurological shortcut. Your synapses are firing in a vacuum, and they're reaching for the most dramatic imagery they can find to explain the cessation of blood flow. I didn't believe in the balance. I didn't believe in the voice. I believed in the 42 milligrams of neurochemicals currently flooding my temporal lobe. But then the map started to change. The map of the United States was still hovering behind the tipped scale, but it wasn't just a two-dimensional representation anymore. It began to pulse with a low-frequency rhythm, like a heart struggling under a heavy load. I could see the city lines, the interstate veins, the massive clusters of the population centers. And then I saw the feed. It wasn't a screen. It was a stream of information that bypassed my eyes and went straight into the processing center of my mind. It was a cascade of human choices. Millions of them. Every second. I saw a man in a boardroom in Midtown Manhattan. I could see the heat map of his intent. It was a jagged, ugly purple. He was looking at a spreadsheet of safety violations for a pipeline project. He knew the welds wouldn't hold. He knew the pressure would eventually fracture the casing. But he looked at the quarterly projection and he deleted the file. The moment he hit that key, a black flag erupted on the map right where he stood. It didn't stop there. I saw the feedback loop. Because of that one choice, 3 years down the line, a watershed would be contaminated. I saw the children who would drink that water. I saw the cellular mutations starting in their gut. I saw the families losing their homes because the land was no longer viable. One choice, 1,000 points of necrosis. I'm a scientist. I understand cause and effect. I understand how a single outlier can ruin an entire data set. But I'd never seen it like this. It wasn't about good or bad. Those are subjective terms. It was about friction. Every time a person chose their own gain over the integrity of the system, it created a spark of friction, and those sparks were accumulating. And Denzel is describing a vision of social behavior that mirrors what complexity scientists call cascading failure. In high-density systems like a city or a national economy, a single point of failure can trigger a series of events that eventually bring down the entire structure. What's striking here is that he doesn't see these actions as moral failings in the traditional sense. He sees them as biological feedback loops. He's viewing the nation as a single living organism. When one cell, one person stops functioning for the benefit of the whole and begins to act only for itself, that is the literal definition of a cancer. Denzel is observing the cellular decay of a society from a perspective that removes the emotion and leaves only the cold, that's hard mechanics of the collapse. The black flags were spreading so fast I couldn't track the individual vectors anymore. I looked at New York. It was nearly buried under them. They were thickest around the centers of power, the banks, the government offices, the media hubs, but they were also in the neighborhoods. I saw a landlord in Brooklyn cutting the heat in February to force a family out. Flag. I saw a teenager in Queens spreading a lie online that he knew would lead to a girl's suicide. Flag. The flags weren't just markers. They were openings. I looked closer at one of the flags in the Bronx. It looked like a tear in the fabric of the map. Through that hole, I could see something moving. It wasn't human. It was a dense, vibrating mass of something that looked like static. It was waiting. The voice came back. It wasn't louder, but it felt more pressurized. The chambers are open, it said. The choices of the few have unlatched the doors for the many. I shook my head. I was still trying to find a rational exit. This is a statistical impossibility, I said. My voice sounded thin against the vacuum. You're showing me a worst-case scenario. Systems have redundancies. They have self-correcting mechanisms. People change. They learn. Look at the scale, Denzel, the voice replied. I looked. The pan filled with a dark mass, the one that had hit the bottom, wasn't just sitting there. It was growing. It was absorbing the light from the other side. The other pan, the one with the flicker of light, was being pulled up. It was so high now I could barely see what was in it. I strained my eyes. I saw small, isolated moments. A woman in an ER in Chicago staying 3 hours past her shift to hold the hand of a man who was dying alone. A mechanic in Ohio refusing to overcharge a widow for a transmission she didn't need. These were the points of light. They were holding the balance. They were the only things preventing the beam from snapping entirely. But they were being outweighed. I felt a surge of something hot in my chest. It wasn't the cardiac arrest. It was a realization. As a scientist, I've spent my life thinking that we can solve anything with enough information, enough resources, enough time. But I was looking at a deficit that couldn't be filled by a lab. The map of the country started to glow red. Not the red of a sunset, the red of an overheat warning on a reactor. The thermal threshold, I whispered. I recognized the pattern. It was a heat map of a system reaching the point of no return. Late May, the voice said, the friction becomes fire. This creates a significant tension between the scientific worldview and the prophetic tradition. Denzel is being shown a future that appears determined by the weight of the past. In physics, we talk about entropy, the natural tendency of a system to move toward disorder. Once entropy reaches a certain level, the system cannot be reversed without a massive injection of external energy. Theologically, this energy is often called intercession or mercy. But from Denzel's perspective, he is seeing a cold calculation of probability. The friction of millions of selfish choices has created a heat that the social fabric can no longer contain. The question this account raises isn't just about whether we can be good, but whether a system that has been compromised at its foundation can ever be stabilized again, or if it must first burn to the ground. I couldn't look at the map anymore. The black flags were vibrating now, making a sound like a swarm of insects. It was a high-pitched whine that made my head feel like it was going to split. I turned away from the balance, and the ash field was gone. Now I was standing on a street corner. I knew this place. It was Broadway and 42nd. But the lights of Times Square were dark. The giant screens that usually blast advertisements were shattered, hanging from their frames like dead skin. There was no sound of traffic, no sirens, just the wind whistling through the broken glass. I looked down at my feet. The pavement was covered in a layer of fine, gray powder, ash. I saw people. They were sitting on the curbs, leaning against the husks of abandoned cars. They weren't screaming. They weren't running. They looked hollow, like the light had been turned off inside them. I saw a man holding a briefcase, just staring at a pile of rubble where a bank used to be. I saw a mother trying to wrap a tattered coat around a child who wasn't moving. The air tasted like burnt plastic and old copper. It was the smell of a city that had been incinerated from the inside out. This hasn't happened yet, I said. I was talking to myself now, trying to anchor my mind to the timeline. Today is May. I'm in a lab. Sarah is doing compressions. This is just a simulation. This is a projection based on the current trends. I walked toward the man with the briefcase. I wanted to touch his shoulder, to ask him what year it was, what happened, who was in charge. But as I reached out, he looked up. His eyes weren't eyes. They were just mirrors. I saw my own reflection in them, not the 33-year-old scientist in a lab coat, but a version of me that looked like I had been walking through a war zone for a decade. The balance tipped. he said. His voice was a rasp, like sandpaper on stone. We didn't think the small things mattered. We thought the system would hold. He pointed toward the horizon, toward the Hudson River. The sky was a bruised orange, and rising from the water was a column of fire that reached into the clouds. It wasn't a natural fire. It was a vertical line of pure white heat. May, the man whispered. The end of the month. That's when the cooling failed. Suddenly, the street corner dissolved. The broken glass, the gray ash, the hollow people, they all vanished into a blur of motion. I was being pulled again, not away from the vision, but deeper into it. I saw a figure standing a long way off, maybe a half mile, maybe a light year. Distance didn't mean anything here. The figure was standing in a field that wasn't made of ash. It was made of something green and vibrant, a color so deep it felt like it was humming. I started to walk. I didn't have a choice. The vacuum was gone, replaced by a pressure that was pushing me forward. My skeptical mind was still screaming. This is the final stage of hypoxia, Denzel. The brain is constructing a savior figure to ease the transition into permanent darkness. Don't follow it. But my legs, or whatever was moving me, didn't care about the science. I took one step, and the sound of the swarm disappeared. I took another, and the smell of the burnt plastic was gone. I was walking toward the only thing in this whole wreck of a universe that didn't look like it was about to break. Notice Denzel's internal dialogue. Even as he walks through a post-apocalyptic New York, even as he sees a future that defies his understanding, he is still using the language of his profession. He calls the vision a simulation. He identifies the savior figure as a neurological construct. This is a classic psychological defense mechanism known as intellectualization. When a person is faced with an experience that is so emotionally or spiritually overwhelming that it threatens to shatter their identity, they retreat into the tools they know. For Denzel, those tools are numbers, trends, and biological explanations. He is fighting to maintain the scientist identity because if he lets that go, he has nothing left to protect him from the reality of what he's seeing. He is a man clutching a ruler while standing in front of a hurricane. I kept walking. The green field was getting closer, but the path was crowded. I started to notice people standing on either side of me. These weren't the hollow people from the broken city. These were people who were in the middle of their pain. I saw a woman kneeling in the grass, sobbing into her hands. I saw an old man looking at a photograph that was slowly turning to ash in his fingers. I saw thousands of them. It was a sea of grief. I tried to stop. I wanted to help them. I'm trained to fix things. I'm trained to find the solution. But every time I tried to turn towards someone, I felt a sharp tug in my center. I was tethered to the figure in the distance. The figure was Jesus. I knew it the way you know the sun is up without looking at it. It wasn't a religious realization. It was a recognition of a primary source, like finding the original document after years of looking at bad photocopies. He was standing perfectly still. His arms weren't open in some grand gesture. They were just at his sides. He was waiting. As I got closer, the sound of the people crying began to change. It started to harmonize. It wasn't just noise anymore. It was a frequency. I looked at my hands. They were starting to glow with the same white gold light that I'd seen on the balance. I was about 50 feet away when I stopped. The skepticism finally broke. Not because I saw a miracle, but because I saw his face. He wasn't looking at the crowd, he was looking at me. And in his eyes, I didn't see judgment. I didn't see the result of the simulation. I saw the equation. I saw the only variable that could actually change the outcome of the map. I reached out my hand, and for the first time since the pipette shattered in the lab, I felt like I was actually touching something real. The contact wasn't what I expected. In the lab, when you touch a surface, there's a transfer of thermal energy. You feel the heat or the cold, the texture of the material, the friction of the molecules. When I reached out toward that green field, toward that figure, I expected a sensory bypass, a hallucination of touch. Instead, it felt like the first time I had ever been awake. Everything before that moment, the biotech facility, the filtration units, even the air in New York, felt like a low-resolution copy. This was the source code. My fingers didn't just feel the grass. I felt the vibration of the growth. I felt the cellular respiration of every blade. I'm a scientist. I've spent my life looking at the universe as a machine that needs to be taken apart to be understood. But standing there, I realized I was a component trying to analyze the engineer. I looked at Jesus. He wasn't glowing in the way you see in religious art. It was more that he was the only thing in the entire field that was fully solid. Everything else, including me, felt like it had a lower density, like we were made of smoke, and he was made of stone. I looked back at the crowds I had just walked through. They were still there, kneeling in the ash-gray shadows just outside the green. The sound of their crying was different now. It wasn't just noise. It was a mathematical constant. It was the sound of the friction I had seen on the map, the accumulation of every selfish choice, every lie, every moment where the system had been compromised. Is the damage irreversible? I asked. I didn't use my voice. I used my intent. In this place, language was too slow. It was like trying to transmit a terabyte of information through a copper wire. Jesus looked at me. He didn't answer immediately. He turned his gaze toward the horizon, where the column of white fire was still rising from the Hudson. You look at the result and call it a failure, he said. His voice didn't travel through the air. It resonated in my marrow. But you do not look at the input. I shook my head. I've seen the input. I saw the map. I saw the black flags. The necrosis is at 60%. In any biological system, once you hit that threshold, the organism enters a state of multi-organ failure. The cooling fails. The fire starts. You're showing me the end of the month. Late May, I can see the timeline. It's a closed loop. I was arguing. Even dead or whatever I was arguing in the data. I wanted him to tell me the math was wrong. I wanted him to show me the error in my calculations. He took a step toward me. The grass didn't bend under his feet. It seemed to rise up to meet him. The math is correct, Denzel, he said, but your equation is missing the only variable that isn't a constant. Commentary. Type 1 Denzel is engaging in what we call theological resistance. He's presented with a figure that transcends his understanding of reality, yet he continues to use the framework of a biological system to diagnose the state of the world. He sees the coming disaster not as a judgment, but as a thermal threshold, a point where the social friction becomes physical heat. This transition is crucial. He has moved from the observation void of the scales to a source environment. In NDE literature, this is often described as a place of heightened reality where the laws of physics are not violated, but rather fulfilled in a way that our current instruments cannot measure. Denzel is looking for a patch for the system, while the source is trying to show him the nature of the power source itself. I didn't understand. I've spent 33 years balancing equations. If you have a deficit on one side, you have to find a corresponding value to balance it. You can't just invent a variable. What variable? I asked. The map is covered in flags. The doors are open. The static is already moving into the streets. I saw New York. It's a wreck. The infrastructure is gone. The cooling systems, the things that keep the city from melting down, they're red-lined. Late May is the point of ignition. How do you balance a fire that has already started? Jesus reached down and picked up a handful of the gray ash that was creeping into the green field. He held it out to me. The fire you see is the friction of the heart, he said. The cooling system is the breath of the few. I looked at the ash in his palm. It was vibrating. I realized it wasn't soot. It was the choices I'd seen earlier, the lies, the pride. I don't know how to fix hearts, I said. My voice, my intent cracked. I work with proteins. I work with antimicrobial coatings. I can stop a virus, but I can't stop a man from deleting a safety report. I can't stop a city from tearing itself apart. You cannot, he agreed. But the variable is not in the fixing. It is in the holding. He pointed back toward the scale, the equilibrium metric. I could see it again, hovering in the distance, the beam tilted so far it looked ready to snap. Look at the flicker on the light side, he said. I looked. It was smaller than a grain of salt. That is the intercession, he said, the weight that holds the beam when the dark demands it break. I felt a surge of disbelief. It was the same skeptic's reflex that had been barking in my head since the lab. You're telling me a few isolated acts of kindness are supposed to counteract a national systemic collapse? That's not a balance. That's a rounding error. It doesn't have the mass to move the scale. Jesus looked at me, and for the first time I felt a weight in his gaze that made my knees buckle. You think mass is the only thing that creates gravity, he said. But in this place, the weight of one true word can move a mountain of lies. The variable is the prayer of those who see the flags and do not turn away. I went down. I didn't fall, I lost the ability to stand. I was kneeling in the grass, and the green light was soaking into my skin. Late May, I whispered. What happens in late May? The threshold is reached, he said. The chambers are full. Unless the variable is applied, the friction will complete its work. The fire will move from the map into the marrow. The date Denzel is identifying, the late May threshold, aligns with a specific type of tension we are seeing in our national infrastructure. We often think of system failure as something that happens in a vacuum, but engineers talk about stress state accumulation. Bridges don't fall because of one heavy truck. They fall because of years of microfractures that finally reach a critical density. Denzel's vision suggests that our social and moral microfractures have reached that density. When he talks about the cooling failing in New York, he is describing a city that has lost its ability to regulate its own tension. Whether it's a failure of the power grid, the supply chain, or the social order, he's pointing to a window in late May where the heat of our collective choices finally breaches the containment. This isn't a prediction of a single event, it's a diagnosis of a system that has run out of redundancies. I stayed on my knees. I was trying to process the scale of what he was saying. As a scientist, I've always believed that the individual is insignificant in the face of the macro. One molecule doesn't change the temperature of the room, one cell doesn't change the health of the body, but he was showing me a reality where the individual was the only thing that mattered. He was showing me that the rounding error, the small hidden acts of those who were still looking for the source, was the only thing holding the entire Manhattan grid from slipping into the ash. The people need to know the date, I said. I have to go back and tell them. I have to warn them about the threshold. If they know the deadline, they'll change. They'll fix the math. Jesus shook his head. They have been told, he said. The warnings are written in the air, in the soil, and in the silence of their own rooms. They do not need a date. They need a return. He reached out and touched my shoulder. The moment his hand landed, the green field exploded into a white light that was so intense it felt like I was being vaporized. I felt the ash field disappear. I felt the New York street corner vanish. I felt the map of the dead zones dissolve. I was being pulled back. Hard. The transition was violent. It wasn't a gentle drift. It was a high-speed collision with my own body. I heard the sound of 1,000 glass slides shattering one last time. Tell them the variable is still active, the voice said. And then I felt the cold, the 64-degree chill of the biotech lab, the smell of the nitrile gloves, the metallic taste of the cardiac drugs in my throat. I felt Sarah's hands on my chest, the heel of her palm grinding into my ribs. I felt the floor. Hard. Linoleum. Real. I opened my eyes, and the white light of the fluorescent tubes was so bright it made me scream. The word intercession that Jesus uses in Denzel's account has a specific etymology that fits the scientific lens perfectly. It comes from the Latin intercedere, which means to go between. In a mechanical system, we use intercessors, like insulators or lubricants, to prevent two moving parts from creating enough friction to melt the machine. Denzel was shown that prayer and selfless action aren't just religious rituals. They are the insulators of the social organism. They are what goes between the choice and the consequence. When those insulators are removed, the system reaches the thermal threshold he saw in the vision. Language, it seems, has always had a technical term for what holds the world together. I tried to sit up, but Miller held me down. Don't move, Denzel. Stay down. We've got a pulse. We've got him back. He was crying. Miller, a guy who usually spends his lunch hour reading peer-reviewed journals on molecular biology, was sobbing like a child. Sarah was white as a sheet. Her hands were shaking as she pulled the paddles away from my chest. I could see the red marks on my skin where the electricity had hit me. The pipette, I whispered. My throat felt like it was full of broken glass. It shattered. Forget the pipette, man, Miller said, his voice cracking. You were gone. 3.5 minutes. You were flatlined. We couldn't get you back. I looked up at the ceiling. I looked for the dust on the ventilation ducts. It was there. a thin gray layer of neglect. I looked at the clock on the wall, 2:51 p.m. It had only been a few minutes, but I could still feel the green light in my marrow. I could still see the black flags on the map. I looked at Sarah. I wanted to tell her about the variable. I wanted to tell her that the work we were doing here, the proteins, the antimicrobials, the coatings, it was all just a surface level fix, that there was something else happening, something that was reaching a threshold in late May. But as I tried to speak, I felt the skeptic come back. It was a dream, Denzel, a lack of oxygen to the brain. You saw what you wanted to see. You saw a balance because you're a scientist. You saw Jesus because that's what the culture tells you is at the end of the tunnel. But then I remembered the man with the briefcase on the street corner. I remembered the reflection in his mirror eyes. I looked at my hands, they were still shaking. I wasn't the same man who had stepped away from the bench 4 minutes ago. The equation had changed, and the date was getting closer every second. I spent the next 48 hours strapped to a telemetry monitor in a recovery ward at NYU Langone. The sound of the EKG was a constant. Beep, beep, beep. It's a rhythmic readout of a mechanical pump. I found myself staring at the green line on the screen, watching the P wave, the QRS complex, the T wave. I was looking for the deviation. I wanted to see the moment the rhythm failed, the moment the machine went out of spec. The cardiologist came in on the second morning. He had a folder of printouts, the hard copy of my heart's silence. "Everything looks normal now, Denzel," he said. He was looking at his tablet, not at me. "Your enzymes are slightly elevated, which we expect after compressions. Your echocardiogram shows no structural defects. We're calling it a transient electrical event." Transient, I repeated. I tasted the word. It was a placeholder, a way of saying we don't know why the system shut down. "How long was the asystole?" I asked. He hesitated. 3 minutes and 42 seconds of non-perfusing rhythm. You weren't with us." I wanted to tell him I was with a primary source. I wanted to tell him that while he was looking for a short circuit in my heart, I was looking at a map of a dying nation. I wanted to tell him that my brain wasn't starving for oxygen. It was being flooded with a set of variables that his instruments couldn't detect. But I didn't. I'm a scientist. I know what happens to the career of a researcher who starts talking about golden scales and vertical columns of fire. I'd be pulled from the lab. My grants would vanish. I'd be a specimen, not a peer. So I sat there. I let them measure my blood pressure. I let them check my reflexes. I acted like the man they expected me to be. But every time I closed my eyes, the white light of the green field hit my retinas. I could still feel the weight of the hand on my shoulder. I could still see the dark mass on the scale. The document Denzel is referencing, the telemetry strip, is a cold, ink-on-paper record of a person's absence. In medical litigation and board reviews, these strips are treated as final. They show the flat line. They show the moment the electrical impulses of the heart cease. But there is a detail in these records that medical language often bypasses. In cases like Denzel's, patients often show what is called atonal gasping, or burst activity in the brain just as the heart restarts. The official report calls this a recovery spike. It's a purely mechanical description, but it doesn't account for why the patient wakes up with a precise, high-resolution memory of a place that shouldn't exist. The record tracks the return of the rhythm. It is completely blind to what the rhythm brought back with it. They discharged me on Friday. I took a cab back to my apartment in Harlem. The city felt different. I looked out the window at the crowds on 125th Street. I saw the people waiting for the bus, the vendors, the kids coming home from school. I didn't see people. I saw points on the map. I saw a man yelling into his phone, and I could almost see the black flag sprouting from the sidewalk at his feet. I saw a woman give her sandwich to a homeless man, and for a split second, I saw a flicker of that green light. The city was humming with a frequency I had never noticed before. It was the sound of the friction, the accumulation of millions of choices. I got to my apartment and sat on the edge of my bed. I didn't turn on the lights. I just sat in the dark, listening to the muffled sounds of the neighbors, the sirens in the distance, the hum of the refrigerator. I kept thinking about the end of May. Jesus had called it a threshold, a point where the friction becomes fire. I'm trained to look for trends. I'm trained to project outcomes. And when I look at the world now, when I read the headlines about infrastructure failures, the rising tensions, the breakdown of the social fabric, I don't see news. I see the red line on the reactor. I went to my desk and opened my laptop. I have a file there, a set of notes I've been keeping for a year on systemic risk in urban environments. It's all very sterile, all very objective. I tried to type, I wanted to write down what he told me about the variable. I wanted to write that the cooling system for the city isn't the power grid or the water supply, it's the intercession of the few. But the words felt like lead, scientist, biotech lead, rational observer. That version of me was trying to delete the vision. It was trying to categorize it as a hallucination brought on by a sudden drop in cerebral perfusion pressure. I stopped. I looked at my hands. There was a small bruise on my right wrist where the IV had been. It was a physical marker of the event, a bruise from the world that said I had almost died. But the memory of the green field, that wasn't a bruise. It was a graft. It was something new that had been stitched into my identity. I'm 33. I have a career ahead of me. I have a life that was supposed to be about the measurable, the provable, the finite. But the map is still there, in my mind. The black flags are still vibrating, and late May is coming. Denzel is currently sitting in a silence that few people ever experience. It is the silence of a man who has seen the mechanical reality of his world collapse, only to be replaced by a weight he cannot measure. He isn't talking about the fire anymore. He isn't talking about the scales. He is sitting with the realization that his professional tools, the very things he used to define his worth, are useless against the threshold he was shown. In this silence, he isn't a scientist. He isn't a lead researcher. He is a witness who is still waiting for the rest of the world to hear the sound of the friction. What he isn't saying is the most important part. He is afraid that even if he spoke, the noise of the city would drown him out. I went back to the lab on Monday. Sarah and Miller were there. They treated me like I was made of glass. They kept asking if I was okay, if I needed to sit down, if I wanted some coffee. I'm fine. I said I was looking at the centrifuge. It was spinning at 10,000 RPMs, a perfect controlled system. I walked over to the ventilation duct. I looked up. The dust was gone. We had the cleaning crew do a deep scrub of the whole floor while you were out, Miller said. He was standing behind me, his hands in his pockets. We figured after what happened, we needed a fresh start. You know? Clean the air. I nodded. I looked at the clean metal of the vent. I thought about the man with the briefcase. I thought about the broken glass on Broadway. I thought about the columns of fire rising from the Hudson. Late May, I whispered. What's that? Miller asked. Nothing, I said. Just thinking about the project timeline. We need to move the stress tests up. We need to see how the coatings hold up under extreme thermal load. Miller frowned. We have weeks for that, Denzel. Take it easy. We don't have weeks, I said. I looked at him, and for a second I almost told him that the variable he's looking for in the protein sequence isn't there, that the variable is in him, in how he treats the staff, in the lies he tells his wife, in the way he looks at the world when no one is watching. But I didn't say it. I turned back to the bench. I picked up a new pipette. The glass felt cool and heavy in my hand. I'm still a scientist. I still run the tests. I still check the readouts. But I can't stop looking at the clock. I can't stop thinking about the weight on the light side of the scale, the tiny flicker that is the only thing holding the beam. I'm back in the lab. I'm back in the cold. I'm back in the grid. But the sound of the glass shattering is still in my ears. And I'm sitting here, I'm holding this pipette, I'm watching the way the light hits the floor, I'm waiting for the first sign of the heat. The medical telemetry strip from the afternoon of May 4th at the Manhattan biotech facility shows exactly 222 seconds of asystole. It is a flat line of black ink. There is no tremor. There is no electrical activity. According to the standards of the NYU Langone Cardiology Department, there was no brain-heart communication possible during that window. This account creates a specific tension for the neurobiologist who studies the formation of memory. We know that memory requires the synthesis of proteins and the firing of synapses, a process that demands a constant supply of oxygen and glucose. If Denzel's brain was deprived of those for nearly 4 minutes, the physical mechanism for recording a memory was non-functional. Yet he didn't return with a blurred or fragmented dream. He returned with a high-resolution, chronologically consistent report that includes verifiable details he couldn't have seen from the floor. We are left with a choice. Either the medical record is wrong about the state of his brain, or the memory didn't originate in his brain at all. A single gray layer of dust sitting on a ventilation duct 12 feet above a sterile linoleum floor.